The Saxon settler rescues a pregnant pagan. Days later, Apache war drums echo around her cabin. The blood on the snow tells a story of desperation. 3 days ago, Thane Godwin pulled a dying woman from the frozen wasteland outside his cabin. A pagan, heavy with child, her Norse tattoos stark against pale skin. Now, as war drums thunder from the mountains, he realizes his act of mercy may have doomed them both. The wind howls like hungry wolves through the gaps in his timber walls. Each gust carries the scent of coming death, mixed with wood smoke and the metallic bite of fresh snow. Godwin's calloused hands shake, not from cold, but from the weight of what approaches. The woman, Astrid, lies fevered on his rough-hewn bed, whispering prayers to gods he's sworn to forsake. Her swollen belly rises and falls with labored breathing. The child within, restless, as if sensing the danger closing in. Those drums, they've been beating for hours now, growing closer. A rhythm that speaks of war paint and sharpened steel. Godwin knows that sound. He's heard it in nightmares that plague his sleep, remnants of battles best forgotten. The Apache don't venture into these frozen peaks without cause. Something or someone has drawn them here. Astrid's fingers suddenly clench around his wrist with surprising strength. Her fever-bright eyes snap open, pupils dilated with terror as she recognizes the distant percussion. Her cracked lips part, and she speaks a single word in her ancient tongue, a word that turns Godwin's blood to ice and makes him question every choice that led to this moment. Antes de continuarmos com essa história incrível, preciso te fazer alerta importante. Muitos inscritos têm relatado que o YouTube removeu suas inscrições sem aviso. Dá só uma conferida rápida no botão vermelho aí embaixo para garantir que você ainda está inscrito no canal. Não quero que você perca nenhum conteúdo exclusivo que vem por aí. E já que você está aí, deixa aquele like poderoso que me ajuda muito com o algoritmo. E me conta nos comentários, de qual cidade você está assistindo? Adoro conhecer cada pessoa incrível que faz parte dessa comunidade. Sua participação faz toda a diferença. Vamos interagir. 3 weeks had passed since Thane Godwin last saw another human face. The Saxon settler preferred it that way. Solitude was safer than company in these unforgiving borderlands where winter carved its name into everything it touched. His cabin, built with his own scarred hands, stood like a lonely sentinel against the endless white expanse of the frontier. Smoke curled from the stone chimney he'd mortared with clay and desperation, the only sign of life for miles. The wind that night cut through the forest like Saxon steel, finding every crack in the timber walls despite his best efforts to seal them. Godwin moved through his evening routine with the mechanical precision of a man who'd learned that survival demanded ritual. Check the fire, secure the door, clean the rifle, pray to a god who seemed as distant as the warmth of human company. His breath misted in the frigid air inside the cabin as he ladled thin soup from the iron pot hanging over his hearth. The scent of salted pork and wild onions filled his nostrils, a meager comfort against the howling wilderness beyond his walls. Somewhere in the darkness, wolves sang their ancient songs to the moon, their voices weaving through the pine-scented night. Godwin's past clung to him like frost on morning grass, memories he'd tried to bury beneath years of isolation and honest labor. The weight of old sins pressed against his shoulders as he prepared for another long winter night. He'd come to this God-forsaken place to escape judgment, both divine and mortal. Here, among the wolves and the whispered threats of hostile tribes, a man could disappear entirely. The storm struck with the fury of a berserker's rage, transforming the world outside into a white chaos of wind and ice. Snow drove horizontal against his windows, and the cabin groaned under nature's assault. Godwin fed more wood to the fire, watching the flames dance like ancient spirits in the hearth. The sound of splitting logs mixed with the storm's roar, creating a symphony of survival. It was during a brief lull in the wind that he heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the wilderness, a human cry, weak and desperate, carried on the icy air. Godwin froze, his hand halfway to the rifle leaning against the wall. In this land, unexpected visitors usually meant trouble of the deadly kind. But the cry came again, weaker this time, tinged with something that pierced through his hardened survivor's instincts. Genuine suffering. Godwin cursed under his breath, knowing his Christian conscience wouldn't let him ignore a soul in distress, regardless of the danger it might bring to his door. He wrapped himself in his thickest fur cloak and stepped into the storm's embrace. The cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and making his eyes water. Snow immediately began accumulating on his shoulders as he fought through drifts that reached his knees. His boots crunched through the frozen crust, each step a small battle against the storm's fury. There, barely visible against the white ground, lay a dark shape that resolved into human form as he approached. A woman, collapsed and still, her long dark hair spread across. Godwin's heart hammered as he knelt beside her, checking for signs of life with hands already numbing from the cold. She breathed, barely. Her skin was pale as birch bark, lips tinged blue from the cold. But what made Godwin's blood run cold wasn't her condition. It was what he saw when the wind parted her torn cloak. Intricate tattoos spiraled up her arms in patterns he recognized from old battles, Norse symbols, pagan markings, and hanging from a leather cord around her neck, an amulet carved with runes that seemed to pulse with their own dark energy. Her belly, swollen with advanced pregnancy, rose and fell with shallow breaths beneath fabric that spoke of tribal craftsmanship. Everything about her screamed danger, connection to the hostile forces that haunted these mountains. Allegiance to gods his own people had spent generations trying to forget. Godwin's mind raced through his options as snow continued to bury them both. Leave her to die and preserve his safety, or risk everything for a woman who might bring his enemies directly to his door. The wind howled around them, like the voices of angels and demons, each arguing for his soul. Compassion won. Cursing his soft heart, Godwin gathered the unconscious woman in his arms, surprised by her solid weight. She was no frail maiden, but a warrior's woman, built strong for survival in harsh lands. Her head lolled against his chest as he fought his way back through the storm to his cabin. Every step a monumental effort against wind that seemed determined to claim them both. Inside, the warmth hit like a blessing. Godwin laid her gently on his own bed, the only soft place in the sparse cabin. As he began removing her wet outer garments to prevent frostbite, she stirred. her eyelids fluttering open to reveal eyes the color of storm clouds. She spoke in a mixture of Old Norse and broken Saxon, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, I am Astrid. Protect the child." Her hand moved instinctively to her swollen belly, the universal gesture of a mother shielding her unborn. The name confirmed his worst fears. Norse, probably connected to the raiding parties that had been terrorizing settlements to the east. But the desperation in her voice, the way her hand trembled as it sought his, spoke to something deeper than tribal politics. "You're safe," he heard himself saying, the words committing him to a path he couldn't take back. "Both of you." Astrid's eyes filled with tears that could have been relief or fever. She squeezed his hand with surprising strength before consciousness slipped away again, leaving Godwin alone with his decision and its unknown consequences. That's when he heard it, distant but unmistakable. The rhythmic pounding of war drums echoing across the frozen peaks, carried on the night wind like a promise of violence. The sound made his blood freeze in his veins. Apache drums, the heartbeat of war parties preparing for battle. Astrid's eyes snapped open at the first drumbeat, her pupils dilated with pure terror. Her hand shot out to grip his arm with desperate force, fingernails digging into his skin through the rough fabric of his shirt. She stared at the ceiling, as if she could see through the wooden planks to the source of that ominous rhythm. Her lips parted, and she whispered one word that made every hair on Godwin's neck stand on end. "Fenrir," she breathed, the ancient name hanging in the air like a curse made manifest. Godwin's world tilted on its axis. That name, spoken in his native Saxon tongue, not Norse, cut through him like a blade forged from his darkest memories. Only one person had ever called him by that war name, the brutal moniker earned during the blood-soaked campaigns along the Welsh borders. The name he'd buried along with his past when he fled to this wilderness exile. His hand moved instinctively to the old scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, a permanent reminder of the night everything changed, the night he'd failed to protect the one person who mattered more than his own soul. Astrid. The truth hit him like a warhammer to the chest. Not just any Norse woman. His Astrid, the Celtic Norse prisoner he'd claimed as his own during that blood-soaked summer campaign. The woman who'd shared his bed and learned his language. The woman who'd vanished the night the Welsh princes launched their desperate counterattack on the Saxon encampment. The woman he thought he'd lost forever when he found her tent empty, soaked with blood that the camp healer swore meant certain death. But those tattoos, they were new, darker. The spiraling patterns seemed to pulse with malevolent life in the firelight. And the amulet at her throat wasn't the simple iron cross he'd given her 3 winters ago. This was something older, carved from what looked like blackened bone, inscribed with runes that hurt to look at directly. The war drums grew louder, closer. More complex rhythms joined the first, creating a symphony of approaching violence that made the cabin walls seem thin as parchment. But now Godwin understood. They weren't random Apache war parties. They were hunting her. Astrid's fever-bright eyes locked onto his, and when she smiled, it was with teeth too sharp, too white. "Did you miss me, my savage Saxon wolf?" Her voice carried undertones that hadn't been there before. harmonics that seemed to echo from deeper places than flesh should allow. The child in her womb moved with violent purpose, and for one horrifying moment, Godwin saw the outline of tiny hands pressed against her skin. Hands that had too many fingers. "What did they do to you?" he whispered. But even as the words left his lips, he knew the question was wrong. The correct question, the one that made his warrior's instincts scream warnings, was what had she become? They? Astrid's laugh was like winter wind through a graveyard. "Oh, my precious Fenrir, I found them. The old gods you Saxons are so eager to forget. They gave me gifts." Her hand moved to the bone amulet, and the runes flared with sickly light. "They gave me purpose. They gave me you." The drums stopped. In the sudden silence, Godwin heard something far worse than Apache war cries. He heard chanting in a language that predated Christ, predated Rome, predated everything civilized humanity had built to keep the darkness at bay. Voices that seemed to rise from the earth itself, carrying words that made the fire in his hearth burn green and cast shadows that moved independently of their owners. Astrid sat up on the bed, with fluid grace impossible for a woman so far along with child. "I've been looking for you for so long, my love. Across battlefields, through forests, following the scent of your guilt." The thing in her womb kicked again, and this time Godwin clearly saw the outline of horns pressing against her distended skin. "The prophecy required a willing heart," she continued, reaching toward him with fingers that seemed longer than they should be. "A Saxon warrior who would take in a pregnant Norse woman out of mercy, who would shelter the mother of Ragnarok's herald in his own home, who would, through compassion, damn his entire world." Outside, something scratched at the cabin walls. Not claws, not weapons, human fingernails, dozens of them, dragging across the timber in rhythm with her heartbeat. The scratching stopped. In the suffocating silence that followed, Godwin heard something far worse, his own name being whispered by multiple voices outside the cabin walls. Not Fenrir, his birth name, the name only his blood family had known. "Godwin! Godwin! Come out, brother!" His legs nearly buckled. That voice calling through the storm-thick darkness belonged to a throat he'd watched ravens feast upon 3 winters past. A voice that should have been silenced forever beneath 10 feet of frozen earth. Cenwulf? The name scraped from his throat like rusted iron. Astrid's too sharp smile widened. "Your dear brother survived that Welsh blade, my love?" "Barely. But the old gods don't let useful servants die so easily." She caressed her writhing belly with both hands now, and the bone amulet pulsed brighter. "He's been so eager to reunite with the brother who left him to die." The scratching resumed, but now Godwin could distinguish individual patterns, not random clawing, deliberate marks being carved into his door, runic symbols that burned themselves into his vision, even through the thick timber. The same markings that covered Astrid's flesh. "You fled, coward!" Cenwulf's voice drifted through the wall, clearer now, closer. "Left me bleeding in Welsh mud while you saved your own Saxon skin. But the vulva found me, taught me, showed me what you really are. Godwin's mind reeled. The night he'd abandoned his wounded brother haunted every dream, every waking moment of the 3 years since. He'd told himself Cenwulf was already dead. That staying would have meant 2 corpses instead of 1. The lie that had driven him to this frozen exile, seeking punishment in solitude. "What is a vulva?" he whispered, though something deep in his warrior's blood already knew the answer. "A satyr witch," Astrid purred, rising from the bed with impossible grace. Her swollen form cast shadows that moved like living serpents across the walls. "A priestess of the old ways. She found your broken brother and gave him purpose, gave him me." Her hand moved to the amulet, and the green firelight revealed its true nature, not bone, but carved from a human skull. "I am the bait, beloved, the pregnant pagan you couldn't resist saving, the final piece needed to complete the binding." The cabin door exploded inward with the sound of splintering timber and ancient fury. Through the wreckage stepped a figure that wore Cenwulf's face, but moved with the predatory grace of something that had tasted death and found it sweet. His left arm hung at an unnatural angle, the old wound from that Welsh spear, but his right gripped a sea-axe blade that gleamed with fresh blood. Behind him came others, Saxon warriors Godwin recognized from old campaigns. Men he'd watched die in battles across the borderlands. They moved in perfect silence, their eyes reflecting firelight like wolves. Each bore the same spiraling tattoos as Astrid, the same runes carved into exposed flesh. "Brother." Cenwulf's smile was a mirror of Astrid's, too wide, too sharp. "The vulva promised me revenge, but this is so much sweeter. You didn't just abandon me to die. You delivered yourself to fulfill the prophecy." Astrid laughed, a sound like ice cracking on a frozen lake. "The child comes now, the herald of the final winter, and Fenrir the Saxon wolf will be its first sacrifice, willing flesh given by a compassionate heart." The thing in her womb moved with violent purpose, pressing against her skin from within. But as Godwin watched in horror, he realized the terrible truth. The child wasn't pushing to get out. It was making room for something else to crawl in. Godwin's hand moved to the iron cross hanging beneath his tunic, the one sacred thing that had kept him sane through 3 winters of exile. His fingers closed around the familiar weight, and he whispered the Lord's Prayer through gritted teeth. The cross burned, not with holy fire, but with the same sickly green light that pulsed from Astrid's bone amulet. Pain seared through his palm as the metal grew white-hot against his skin, and when he yanked it free, the leather cord smoking, he saw the truth that shattered his world. The cross bore the same runic inscriptions as Astrid's amulet, the same spiraling patterns that covered the flesh of his undead brother and the walking corpses crowding through his doorway. The holy symbol he'd carried from childhood, given to him by the monastery's head priest, was carved with pagan markings that now writhed like living serpents in the firelight. "No." The word escaped his lips like a dying breath. Cenwulf's broken laughter filled the cabin. "Did you think it was coincidence, brother, that Father Aldrich chose you, a bastard Saxon foundling, for special blessing?" He stepped closer, the Welsh spear wound in his arm weeping fresh black blood. The vulva opened my eyes, showed me what you've always been. Astrid's voice joined her mate's, harmonizing in tones that made the very air vibrate with malevolent power. The chosen vessel. The Saxon Fenrir, who would carry the binding charm unknowing for 23 winters, who would nurture it with faith and prayer until the moment came. The cross in Godwin's palm pulsed like a beating heart, and with each pulse, memories flooded back, memories that couldn't be his own. A stone altar, slick with virgin blood, robed figures chanting in the pre-dawn darkness. An infant's cry, cut short by ritual blade. And above it all, Father Aldrich's face, younger but unmistakable, his monk's robes cast aside to reveal skin covered in the same spiraling tattoos. The monastery, Godwin whispered, understanding crushing him like a landslide. It was never Christian. The old gods are patient, Astrid purred, her swollen belly now writhing with shapes that defied nature. They let the Christ worshippers build their stone houses, let them gather the gifted children under one roof, made it so much easier to choose the perfect candidates. The thing inside her was no longer content to wait. Something pressed against her skin from within. Not a child's fist, but fingers too long and joints that bent in impossible directions. As Godwin watched in mounting horror, her belly began to split along lines that followed the tattooed runes, parting like a flower opening to reveal not birth, but a gateway. 23 years of fateful prayer, Cenwulf breathed, his dead eyes reflecting the chaos of firelight and eldritch gleam. Every Ave Maria, every Pater Noster, every moment you thought you were speaking to your gentle Christ, you were feeding power into the binding charm, making yourself the perfect anchor for what comes next. Through the widening tears in Astrid's flesh, darkness deeper than winter night began to pour into the cabin. Not shadow, but emptiness given form. The hungry void that existed before creation, now bleeding through into the world of men. The temperature plummeted until their breath misted white, and frost began forming on the walls despite the blazing hearth. The war drums outside changed rhythm. No longer the steady beat of Apache warriors, but something far older. The heartbeat of the earth itself, counting down to the final moment when the binding would be complete. Godwin's burning cross pulsed brighter, and he felt something vast and ancient stirring in response. Not emerging from Astrid's ruined form, but awakening within his own chest. The thing that had been sleeping there for 23 years, fed by H. His last coherent thought, before the transformation began, was a prayer to a god who might never have existed at all. But as the darkness clawed its way through his ribs, as the ancient thing prepared to tear free from his chest cavity like a wolf pup from its mother's womb, Godwin did the one thing none of them expected. He laughed. Not the broken cackle of a man losing his sanity, but the deep, rumbling mirth of someone who just heard the punchline to a joke 23 years in the making. The sound cut through the eldritch chanting like an axe through rotten wood, and for the first time since Astrid's transformation began, uncertainty flickered across her inhuman features. "You magnificent, ancient fools, Godwin wheezed through the pain, his burning cross now blazing white-hot in his palm. All this elaborate theater, all these careful plans. Blood trickled from the corner of his mouth as he smiled at his undead brother. Did none of your clever vulva seers think to as? Cenwulf's rotting face twisted with confusion. The darkness pouring from Astrid's split belly hesitated, sensing something wrong with its chosen vessel. Godwin pressed the molten cross against his forehead, and the runic inscriptions didn't just burn. They began to change, the spiraling pagan symbols writhing and reshaping themselves into something far older. Something that predated both Christ and the Norse pantheon. Not Saxon, not Christian, Druid-born, he whispered, and the words carried power that made the cabin walls groan. Raised by Celtic priests who knew your old gods were coming, who spent 30 years preparing for this exact moment. The truth hit the room like a warhammer. The monastery hadn't been corrupted by pagan influence. It had been a trap from the beginning. A carefully constructed lure designed to draw out the servants of the old gods and create the perfect opportunity to spring a counter-binding that had taken 3 decades to prepare. Astrid shrieked as the darkness began flowing backward into her torn flesh, no longer emerging, but being pulled back into whatever hollow space it had crawled from. The bone amulet around her neck cracked with the sound of breaking bones. "The child," she gasped, her hands clawing at her splitting belly. "There never was a child," Godwin said, his voice now carrying harmonics that made the air itself vibrate with ancient power. "Just bait. Just the promise of Ragnarok's herald to draw you close enough for the real binding to take hold." Cenwulf raised his blade, but his dead flesh was already beginning to smoke wherever the shadows touched him. "Brother, what have you?" "I am not your brother." The cross in Godwin's hand had transformed completely now. No longer iron, but gleaming white bone, carved with symbols that hurt to perceive directly. Cenwulf of the Saxons died 3 years ago in Welsh mud. I watched. I mourned. I let you stay dead. His eyes now blazing with silver fire, fixed on the thing wearing his brother's face. What stands before me is just meat animated by spite. The drums outside fell silent. Through the shattered doorway, Godwin could see the Apache warriors, the real ones, not the walking dead, backing away from the cabin as something vast and terrible began to manifest in the space between worlds. Astrid's screams took on a new quality as she realized the true scope of the trap. The pregnant pagan woman rescued by a compassionate Saxon, the war drums drawing enemies to surround them, the cross burning with runic fire, every element designed to create the perfect ritual space for something the old gods had never seen coming. 30 years of patient weaving, Godwin breathed, and now his voice carried the weight of Celtic druids chanting in stone circles older than memory. Every prayer a thread in the binding. Every act of mercy another knot in the snare. The thing that had been wearing Astrid's face began to change, revealing glimpses of what lay beneath the human facade. Something with too many teeth and eyes that reflected starlight from spaces between atoms. And in the distance, carried on wind that tasted of oak groves and sacred springs, came the sound that made every servant of the Norse pantheon freeze with primal terror. Celtic war horns, calling across the centuries. The real gods were coming home. The Celtic war horns grew louder, their ancient call reverberating through bone and sinew. But as the sound reached its crescendo, something impossible happened. The horns began to change, their proud, defiant notes warping into something else entirely. Something familiar. Godwin's silver fire eyes widened in horror as recognition dawned. Not Celtic war horns at all, the sound morphing, reshaping itself into the rhythmic chanting he knew by heart. The very prayers he'd whispered every dawn for 23 years. Ave Maria, gratia plena. The words were wrong, twisted. Each Latin phrase now carried undertones in a language that predated Rome, and as the chanting grew closer, Godwin realized the terrible truth. Those weren't druids approaching through the forest. Those were his brother monks from the monastery, their voices raised in the same evening prayers that had comforted him through countless lonely nights. The thing wearing Astrid's face smiled with genuine delight as understanding crashed over Godwin like a landslide. "Did you really think," she purred, "that we hadn't planned for every contingency? That 30 years of careful preparation could be undone in a single moment of revelation?" The bone cross in Godwin's palm began to crumble, its white light flickering and dying. The Celtic symbols carved into its surface weren't being corrupted. They were returning to their true form. Norse runes. The same spiraling patterns that covered every surface in the cabin. "The druids fell centuries ago, beloved," Astrid whispered, her torn belly already beginning to heal. "We made sure of that. But their sacred sites, their stone circles, those made excellent foundations for Christian monasteries." Through the shattered doorway came figures in brown robes, their heads bowed in prayer. Father Aldrich led them, his familiar voice raised in benediction. But the words that spilled from his lips were the same chants that had preceded every major battle in the old wars. War prayers to gods who demanded blood sacrifice. Every morning prayer, the priest said, his kind eyes now blazing with the same eldritch fire as Astrid's amulet. Every evening vesper, every moment you thought you were speaking to Christ, you were strengthening the binding that would make this moment possible. Godwin's legs buckled as the weight of absolute betrayal crashed down on him. The monastery, the foundling child taken in by compassionate monks, the special blessing, the iron cross given with such ceremony. All of it, every moment of faith, every prayer whispered in desperate loneliness, every act of devotion that had defined his entire existence had been feeding power into the very darkness he thought he was fighting. But the revelation, he gasped, falling to his knees. The druid knowledge, the counter-binding, a necessary deception. Father Aldrich smiled with paternal warmth that now felt like ice against Godwin's soul. You needed to believe you had power over us, needed to expend every last drop of that carefully cultivated faith in one glorious moment of defiance. The priest's hand moved to his own chest, where a bone amulet identical to Astrid's hung beneath his robes. "Energy cannot be destroyed, my son, only transformed." The darkness that had been retreating into Astrid's healing form suddenly exploded outward with tenfold fury, no longer seeking to emerge slowly, but pouring into the world like a burst dam. Every prayer Godwin had ever whispered, every moment of desperate faith, every ounce of spiritual energy he'd poured into his counterfeit revelation, all of it now transformed into raw power for the thing that was tearing reality apart at the seams. Cenwulf's corpse face split with hideous joy. "Thank you, brother, for such faithful service, for making this binding stronger than we ever dared hope." Outside, the Apache drums resumed their war rhythm. But now Godwin understood the truth of that sound. Not random tribal raids, but a carefully orchestrated invasion force that had been waiting for this exact moment, when the barriers between worlds would be thin enough for the old gods to step through and reclaim what had been taken from them. As the thing that had never been Astrid began its true transformation, as reality itself started to bend and warp around the expanding darkness, Godwin heard something that made his blood freeze in absolute terror. Laughter. Child's laughter, coming from the forest beyond his cabin. The sound of young voices at play, growing closer through the trees. The child's laughter cut through the eldritch chanting, like a blade through silk. Innocent and pure, in a way that made every corrupted soul in the cabin recoil. Through the shattered doorway came a small Fae. She walked barefoot through the snow without leaving tracks, her simple white dress unmarked by mud or blood despite the carnage surrounding the cabin. Behind her came others, children of various ages, all moving with the same ethereal grace, all bearing the unmistakable features that made Godwin's heart stop. Saxon children, his people's children, the ones who had vanished during the raids 3 years past. "Hello, Uncle Godwin," the girl said, her voice carrying impossible clarity. "Mother Astrid said you'd finally come home." The word uncle hit him like a warhammer. Recognition crashed over him as he stared into eyes the exact shade of storm gray as his own. As Cenwulf's. This wasn't just any child. This was Eadgith, his brother's daughter. The niece he'd watched take her first steps. The little girl who should have been buried beneath 10 feet of frozen earth along with the rest of their slaughtered settlement. "Impossible," he whispered. But more children emerged from the forest shadows. Wulfric, barely 5, who used to beg for stories of distant battles. Aelred, with his gap-toothed grin, who'd carved his first wooden sword under Godwin's guidance. A dozen young faces he'd mourned for 3 winters, now standing in his doorway with eyes that reflected starlight from impossible depths. Astrid's laughter became something beautiful and terrible. "Did you think we'd waste such perfect vessels? Children are so malleable, so eager to please their loving guardians." The truth struck Godwin like lightning splitting an oak. The settlement he'd fled wasn't destroyed by random raiders. It had been harvested. Every child carefully selected and taken. Every adult left to die, not from cruelty, but to ensure no one would come looking for the missing young ones. 3 years we've been raising them, Father Aldrich said with genuine paternal pride. Teaching them the old prayers, the true prayers. Preparing them to be the perfect congregation for what comes next. Little Aegith skipped toward him, her bare feet making no sound on the blood-soaked floorboards. "We've been so good, Uncle. We learned all our lessons. We practiced every day." She reached up to touch his face with fingers that were ice-cold, despite the blazing hearth. "The vulva promised if we were very, very good, we could help you come home too." Godwin's world collapsed completely as he understood the final, crushing layer of the deception. Not just his faith corrupted, not just his prayers twisted to dark purpose. Every child he'd ever cared for, every innocent soul he'd fought to protect, all of them transformed into willing servants of the entities now tearing through reality's fabric. "You see, beloved," Astrid purred, her form now shifting between human and something that defied description. "We needed more than just one anchor. The binding required an entire family tree, blood calling to blood across the veil." Through the cabin's walls came more children, dozens of them. Not just from his settlement, but from every Saxon community that had been raided across the borderlands. An entire generation of the next Saxon bloodline. Their innocence weaponized and turned against everything their ancestors had died to protect. Cenwulf's corpse face split with hideous joy. "Brother, meet your congregation. They've been praying for your soul every single day." And as the children began to recite evening prayers in voices sweet as honey, Godwin heard the words they were truly speaking. Not Latin, not Saxon, but the summoning chant that would call forth every ancient horror that had been waiting behind the veil for 3 long centuries. The war drums outside fell silent. Something vast and patient began to stir in response to those innocent voices raised in perfect, terrible harmony. In the distance, answering calls echoed from every direction, not Apache war cries, but the hunting songs of things that had never been human at all. The children's voices rose in perfect harmony, their innocent faces glowing with eldritch light as reality itself began to buckle under the weight of their summoning chant. But as the final syllable left little Eadgath's lips, something went terribly wrong. The air in the cabin didn't tear open to welcome ancient horrors. Instead, it crystallized, froze solid, like winter lake ice catching the first bitter breath of true winter. Every voice, every chant, every whispered prayer stopped mid-syllable, as if the world itself had suddenly forgotten how to make sound. Astrid's transformed face twisted with confusion, then dawning terror. "No, this isn't. The binding should be—" Her words cut off as golden light began bleeding through the cabin walls. Not the sickly green glow of bone amulets, or the silver fire of corrupted crosses, but warm sunlight that had no business existing in the frozen depths of a storm-lashed night. The light carried with it the scent of summer meadows, of fresh bread, of a mother's gentle hand smoothing a child's fevered brow. Father Aldrich staggered backward, his face a mask of absolute horror. "Impossible. We killed them all. Every last druid, every Celtic priest. We watched their sacred groves burn, but the children, his carefully corrupted congregation, began to change. The starlight faded from their eyes, replaced by confusion and growing terror, as memories that weren't theirs started flooding back. Little Edgith's hand flew to her mouth, as if to catch words that had already escaped. "Uncle Godwin?" Her voice was small, lost, achingly human. Where are we?" "I was picking flowers for Mother." And then tears began streaming down her cheeks as she looked around the blood-soaked cabin. "Why is everything so cold?" Cenwulf's corpse face contorted with rage. "Brother, what if you—" "I am not his brother." The voice came from Godwin's throat, but it wasn't Godwin speaking. The cadence was different, older, carrying the weight of countless summers and the patience of oak trees that had weathered 1,000 storms. When he opened his eyes, they blazed, not with silver fire, but with the deep green of forests that remembered the first dawn. "Godwin of the Saxons died 3 minutes ago," the voice continued, and Astrid's healing belly suddenly split wide again, not to release darkness, but to reveal empty space where the growing horror had simply ceased to exist. His faithful heart stopped beating the moment he realized every prayer had been a lie. The grief killed him more surely than any blade. The thing wearing his body stood with fluid grace that spoke of roots deep in sacred earth. "I am Brennus, last archdruid of the Western Groves, and for 3 years I have been sleeping in this man's bones, waiting for exactly this moment." Father Aldrich's brown robes began smoldering, as if the very air around the druid had become hostile to his presence. "The Celtic bloodlines ended centuries ago. We made certain." "You made certain the druids' bodies died," Brennus corrected, his voice carrying harmonics that made the cabin walls groan with something deeper than wind. "But you never understood the true nature of Saxon foundlings, did you?" The truth hit the room like a warhammer, not a random bastard child taken in by compassionate monks. Not even a carefully selected vessel for their dark purposes. Godwin had been the last living descendant of the Celtic royal line, hidden among the Saxons when the final groves fell. His very bloodline was the key that could unlock not just the barriers between worlds, but the ancient seals that kept the old gods bound. Every prayer he whispered to your false Christ, Brennus said, his green eyes now blazing like emerald stars, fed power not into your binding, but into mine. 23 years of faithful devotion, transformed by grief and betrayal into something your Norse masters never saw coming. The children were fully human again now, huddling together in terror as they realized what they'd been made to do. But their innocence had served its purpose, not as vessels for corruption, but as pure conduits that had unwittingly channeled the greatest working of Celtic magic ever. Not Apache warriors or walking dead, but figures in white that moved with the stately grace of birch trees swaying in summer wind. The real druids were coming home, and they had been dreaming of vengeance for 300 years. The white-robed figures, emerging from the storm, moved with perfect synchronization, their feet finding purchase on ground that should have been treacherous ice. As they drew closer to the cabin, the golden light intensified, and Brennus, wearing Godwin's flesh like borrowed armor, raised his hands in greeting to what should have been his ancient brothers. But little Edith, still trembling in the corner with the other children, suddenly screamed. Not the cry of a frightened child, but the bone-deep shriek of recognition that cut through divine light and druidic power, like a blade through parchment. "Uncle," she sobbed, pointing at the lead figure approaching through the storm. "Uncle, that's the man who killed Mama." Brennus froze, his green fire eyes widening, as the white-robed leader pushed back his hood to reveal a face that made every corrupted soul in the cabin, monk and monster alike, step backward in unified terror. Father Aldrich's voice came out as barely a whisper. "Impossible. You're supposed to be dead. We watched you burn." The figure in white smiled with the patient malevolence of something that had spent centuries planning this exact moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the same harmonics as Brennus, the same ancient authority, but twisted into something that made the very air taste of copper and ash. "My dear corrupted brother," the newcomer said, and starlight seemed to dim in his presence. "Did you really think the arch-traitor of the Western Groves would stay buried in consecrated ground?" Brennus staggered, the color draining from Godwin's stolen face. "Malachar, you died at Camlan. Arthur's blade took your head. You saw what I wanted you to see." Malachar stepped into the cabin, and where his feet touched the blood-soaked floorboards, the wood began to blacken and rot. Just as these children saw their loving protector, not the one who personally slit their mothers' throats to harvest their innocence. The other children began screaming now. Memories flooding back as Malachar's presence shattered whatever mental barriers had been protecting them. Little Wulfric pointed at the druid with a shaking finger. "He wore Papa's face. He smiled like Papa while he completed the most beautiful deception ever woven." Malachar finished with paternal pride. 23 years of preparation, not to serve the Norse gods or the Christian faith, but to create the perfect vessel for something far more ambitious. Astrid's ruined form began laughing again, but now the sound carried notes of absolute despair. "The binding was never meant for the old gods," she whispered, understanding flooding her inhuman features. "It was meant for you." Father Aldrich's bone amulet cracked as he realized the scope of his betrayal. "We were pawns, all of us. The monastery, the corrupted children, the Norse rituals, tools," Malachar confirmed with the casual dismissal of a master craftsman discussing hammers and chisels. "The Norse pantheon provided excellent cover for my true work. Christianity offered the perfect infrastructure. And dear, faithful Godwin," he gestured toward Brennus with mock affection, "provided exactly the pure heart needed to anchor a working that will reshape the very foundations of reality." Brennus tried to speak, but found Godwin's throat constricted. The body he'd claimed was rejecting him, forcing him out as something else began taking residence. "You can't. The Celtic bloodline, the sacred oaths." "Still bind you to serve the Celtic people?" "Yes." Malachar's smile widened to reveal teeth filed to points, every last one of whom now lies in mass graves across 3 kingdoms, murdered by Saxon expansion, except, of course, for the children I've been carefully preserving in this charming performance. The horrible truth crashed down like a collapsing mountain. The white-robed figures weren't druids at all. They were the animated corpses of every Celtic priest who'd ever opposed Malachar's corruption of the sacred arts. The children weren't Saxon foundlings. They were the last living remnants of Celtic bloodlines, kept alive for this exact moment when their ancestral protector would be magically compelled to serve whatever they commanded. Little Adgif looked up at Brennus with eyes that suddenly blazed with terrible knowledge. When she spoke, her 7-year-old voice carried the authority of queens who had ruled when the world was young. "We command you, last guardian of our people," she whispered, and the words hit Brennus like iron chains, wrapping around his soul. "Kill everything in this cabin, starting with yourself." Outside, something vast and patient began to laugh with the sound of civilizations falling. Brennus felt the chains of ancient obligation tightening around his soul, but as little Adgit's command echoed through, the druid's borrowed lips curved into a smile that was neither Godwin's nor his own, but something else entirely. "I obey," he said quietly, and raised Godwin's scarred hands toward his own throat. But instead of flesh, his fingers closed around empty air. The cabin, the children, the corpse druids, Malakar's triumphant sneer, all of it flickered like candlelight in wind and vanished. Brennus stood alone in a vast meadow under summer stars, wearing his own ancient form once more. Across the grass walked a figure he recognized, Godwin the Saxon, whole and unbroken, his storm-gray eyes clear of pain for the first time in 3 winters. "Clever," Godwin said, with genuine admiration. "You made them think they'd won." "The binding required willing sacrifice," Brennus replied, his voice carrying the weight of oak groves and standing stones. "A pure heart, choosing death over corruption." Your grief when you realize the truth, that moment of absolute despair, it shattered every chain they'd woven. Around them, the meadow filled with figures stepping out of starlight. Saxon children running toward their true families. Celtic priest-kings nodding acknowledgement to their last guardian. Even Cenwulf, whole and laughing, his brother's burdens finally lifted from his shoulders. "What of them?" Godwin asked, and they both knew he meant the corruption left behind in the waking world. Malakar's power broke with the binding. The children will wake in worn beds, safe with families who remember them truly. The walking dead return to peaceful rest. Brennus smiled with ancient satisfaction. And the world continues, ignorant of how close it came to ending. They walked together toward the far horizon, where dawn was breaking, not the cold winter sun that had watched over their struggles, but the gentle light of a summer morning that would never end. Behind them, carved into the meadow itself, in letters of living gold, appeared words that would echo in the dreams of bards and storytellers across countless generations. Here walked Godwin the Compassionate and Brennus the Last Guardian, who chose mercy over vengeance, sacrifice over power, and in their choosing, saved a world that would never know their names. The meadow faded, the story ended. But somewhere in the forests of the borderlands, travelers still report hearing children's laughter on summer nights and finding small stone cairns that mark the saga was complete. Se esta saga tocou sua alma, então escute o chamado do Skald. A nossa jornada depende da força do nosso clã, e essa força é você. Você precisa se inscrever agora para que os deuses do algoritmo não te façam perder nossas próximas lendas exclusivas. Este é o momento de mostrar seu valor. Esmague o botão de like para alimentar nossa fogueira e inunde os comentários com suas reações sobre este final. Suas teorias são o ouro do nosso tesouro. E o mais importante, compartilhe instantaneamente este vídeo com pelo menos 5 amigos que precisam conhecer este desfecho. Apenas os verdadeiros guerreiros do nosso clã entendem a importância destas ações. Não espere nem mais um segundo.